And in the parasha this week, you've got the story of Yaakov, as we well know, and the confrontation that he's going to have with his brother Esav. Obviously, the Torah then describes the confrontation, but before he has that confrontation, he davens, because he knows that Esav is not really his friend, and he's worried. He doesn't know what to expect when he comes face to face with Esav. The last time he saw Esav, Esav wanted to kill him, literally wanted to kill him. And now it's however many years later, 20 years of working for Lavan, 14 years that he studied in yeshiva. So it's many, many years later, right? It's around almost 35 years later. And Esav, he thinks maybe by this stage has calmed down until he sends his messengers and they come back and they say, you have to realize Esav is coming to kill you. So then he recognizes the fact that this is a very dangerous time in his life. So obviously he's going to daven. And in his davening, he uses a very interesting expression. And it's that expression that we're going to analyze today. He says, Katointi mikol hachasadim umikol ha'emes asher asisa es avdecha. The word katointi means I've become small, from the word katan. And I become small because of all of the kindness and all of the truth that he's speaking to Hashem, that you have done with your servant, referring to himself. So now we're going to work out, what does he mean that I've been diminished, that I've been made small because of all the kindness that you've done? What exactly is he trying to say? So if you have a look at what Rashi comments, anybody remember what Rashi comments? But when he says, Katonti, that I'm small, he says something very fascinating and very insightful and maybe even a little bit troubling. Because Rashi raises the question, why is Yaakov so nervous? The next thing he's going to say to Hashem is, Hatzileni no miyad achi miyad Esav. Please save me from the hand of my brother Esav. Ki yarei anoichi osai, because I'm afraid of him. Pen yavoi v'hikani aim al bonim, in case he's going to attack me and God forbid kill everybody. Why is he afraid? Okay, let's flip the question. Why should he not be afraid? I mean, after all, his brother is an aggressive human being. He's got big anger issues. He hasn't been for therapy in 3 decades. He hasn't sorted out his stuff. So you can understand why Yaakov is afraid. Why is anybody surprised that Yaakov is afraid? No, why? Because Hashem promised him that he's going to protect him. So what's he worried about? He's got Hashem's promise on more than one occasion. Hashem's told him that he's going to look after him. Plus, look at the history up until this point. Hashem has looked after him, and he has protected him, and he has blessed him in a beautiful way. Because Lavan also wanted in some way to destroy Yaakov. Firstly, he wanted to interfere with his family life. Then he wanted to ruin him financially. Then when it was time for Yaakov to leave, he wanted to interfere and not allow him to leave and lay claim to his family. And Hashem protected him from all of those things. So why is he suddenly afraid now? What's worrying him now? So Rashi says, well, you have to realize that there are 2 things to consider over here. The first is, when you face a danger, that is a time to ensure that you have Hashem's protection. Because in the same way, for example, let's say that somebody had been blessed by Hashem, that they would be protected. Let's just say that Hashem came to you in a dream and he said to you, I'm going to protect you. So does that mean now you should go driving on the highway at 200 kilometers an hour because Hashem said he's going to protect me? Or does that mean that you should go pay a visit to, Syria because Hashem is going to protect you? So the first thing is you have to recognize that when there is clear and present danger, then it's not good enough just to say that Hashem is going to protect me. I also have to take practical steps to protect myself. But beyond that, much more importantly, and this is the part that Rashi points out, is we have to deserve Hashem's protection. And it is possible sometimes that a person may do something that could jeopardize the protection that they're supposed to have. So that's what Rashi says over here. Rashi says that Yaakov's concern was, Shema nislachlachti bechet. Maybe I did something that wasn't appropriate during all of these years since I've been home. Maybe I did something, and as a result of that, maybe I lost the opportunity to have this blessing. Now that's a profound thought, because it tells us that any time in our lives that we feel self-confident because maybe we've done the right thing or because we've read something in the Torah, etc., etc., this is a little bit of a reality check that it's not always that simple, and that it is possible for a person to behave in such a way that they actually lose the opportunity for the divine input or bracha or protection or whatever it is. So that's a very interesting perspective. But the point is, Yaakov is telling us, Kotointi, when I see the extent of the bracha that I need, and when I see the situation that I'm in, it makes me feel small. In other words, it makes me realize my lack. In fact, the word that Rashi uses, which is the word chait, we all translate the word chait as a sin. But that's not the only meaning of the word. I'll give you an example. You speak about the Haftarah, right? So just a couple of weeks ago, we had the Haftarah where at the end of King David's life, his son Adoniyahu, because King David is weak and infirm at the end of his life, so his son Adoniyahu wants to use that opportunity to steal the throne. And that's obviously not what Hashem intends. Hashem intends that King Solomon should be the next king. So between the prophet at the time, who was Nasan the prophet, and Bathsheba, who was the wife of David and the mother of Shlomo HaMelech, they together, they come with a plan that they're going to go to David and they're going to explain to him what's going on and that he has to endorse Shlomo as the next king. In her presentation, Bathsheba says to King David, she says, if you don't do this, then I and my son Shlomo will be chatoim. Now, it sounds like she's saying we'll be sinners because we'll have done something wrong, not having upheld the divine right of kings. But actually what she's saying is we'd be lacking, because the word chait could also mean that something is lacking. In fact, that's why we get different kinds of averas, right? An avera is an outright transgression, whereas a chait could also mean when somebody does something not as well as they should have. So here you're saying means maybe I haven't served Hashem to the extent that I am capable of. That's why Kotointi, I feel small in my own self-assessment when I recognize, number one, all of the brachas that Hashem has already done for me, and number two, what I need in my life right now. So that sounds like that's what's bothering Yaakov at this particular point in time. Now here's where things get really interesting. This parasha Vayishlach is almost always read in direct time frame of a special date on the Chabad calendar. Now, we have a teaching of the Shalah HaKadosh, who was a great mystic, that you always look at the Torah portions and they'll help you understand what's going on with the special dates on the calendar. So, for example, if you jump ahead, Vayeshev, which is the next parasha, is almost always associated with Hanukkah. Right? So, that means that in that story of Vayeshev, there's going to be information about Hanukkah. And so on and so forth, right? Nitzavim we always read before Rosh Hashanah, etc. When it comes to Pesach and to Purim, there's more flexibility because we've got the leap year, so there's a greater range of parashas that typically fall around the time of those Yom Tovs. Now, what's happening in this coming week, meaning after Shabbos, in the upcoming week, is we're going to have the 19th of Kislev. The 19th of Kislev is the anniversary of when the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, was released from prison. He had been arrested by the Russian authorities. They had all trumped up charges against him, but what was really significant is that those included treason charges, which was a capital offense. And so, by all accounts, he shouldn't have gotten out of prison, and he certainly shouldn't have gotten out of prison as quickly as he did. He was in prison for 52 days, and then into a 53rd. So that's the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. Now, why is this relevant to our conversation? Because when he came out of prison, at that time there was this terrible conflict between the Hasidim and the opponents of the Hasidim. That means in the frum world there was this terrible divide. When the Alter Rebbe went into prison, there was great celebration by the opponents of Hasidim, because they thought that this was going to be the end of at least the Chabad Hasidic movement. There were other Hasidic movements in other regions, but they thought that this would be the end of the Chabad Hasidic movement, because they thought the government at the very least would, if not keep him in prison, at least curtail his activities, etc. When the Alter Rebbe was released from prison, and it was very clearly miraculous that he was released from prison, not only the time frame, but also how the proceedings happened, everything was very miraculous. So the Hasidim celebrated, as you can well imagine. And the Alter Rebbe penned a letter to the Hasidim, which is in the book of Tanya. And he starts off that letter with this quotation from Yaakov, our forefather, Katointi mikol hachasadim, that I have been made small because of all the kindness that Hashem has done to me. And part of what he writes in that letter is a stern warning to the Hasidim not to in any way disparage their opponents, because it might be very tempting, to turn around and say, you see, you try to destroy us, and Hashem protected us, whatever. So it's a very strong letter about remaining humble and not flaunting the fact that a miracle happened, and certainly not mistreating other people who were the opponents of Hasidim in the context of this particular story. So there, the Alter Rebbe translates or explains the verse Katonti totally differently to how Yaakov does, even though he's quoting Yaakov. Because in this context, the Alter Rebbe explains that Katonti mikol hachasadim means that every time that Hashem shows a person kindness, the result should be that the person should feel more humble, which is a beautiful lesson, right? And unfortunately, it's not always the way that people behave. In fact, to the contrary, you very often find that when things go well for people, they become self-confident, sometimes even smug, and possibly even arrogant. Look at me, life always goes my way, I'm obviously deserving. And Alter Rebbe's lesson is the exact opposite, that we should recognize every single time that Hashem steps into our lives and gives us something, that should humble us completely, because after all, what have we really done to deserve that kind of intervention and that kind of bracha? And then he takes it a little bit further, and he gives like a slightly different, a slightly more mystical perspective on it, which is, if you think about it this way, anybody will know that if you come face to face with greatness, you actually feel humbled by that greatness. So whoever the people are that we look up to and we believe these are the great people of our society, if we have the opportunity to meet them face to face, in that interaction, we're going to feel very humbled. And so he says you have to realize that every time that Hashem gives a person a bracha, or does chesed, does some kind of kindness for a person in their lives, then you have to realize that's Hashem coming into your world. And if you're closer to Hashem, you should feel more humble than if you were further from Hashem, in which case, you could possibly delude yourself into thinking you're a big deal. So that's his message. Katointi means that we have to be humble because of all the brachas that have happened to us. Now, what's fascinating about this is that when you compare the two, it really looks like Yaakov's version of this verse, Katointi, and the Alter Rebbe's version are almost saying the exact opposites. Because Yaakov is saying it as a prayer because of danger that is coming, and he's asking Hashem to protect him in the face of that danger. The Alter Rebbe is saying it as gratitude after the danger has passed, because he's been through the danger and been saved from the danger, and therefore he's giving gratitude to Hashem and considering the humility that has to follow. Now, it is a little bit strange to have two interpretations of the same verse that seem to be so different, because they're on two opposite ends of the spectrum of experience. And that's not usually how Torah works. Usually when you have multiple explanations about a particular concept, it's because they're very deeply related to each other. So we've got to try and understand that it can't be that we're just going to say there are two versions of how you say this particular line, and it depends on your circumstances. So in Yaakov's circumstances, it was because there was a danger on the horizon, and in the Alter Rebbe's circumstances, it was because the danger had already passed. There's obviously got to be more to the story, and there's got to be a more common thread that runs between these two versions of saying Katonti. So that's really what we're going to try and unpack and learn a lesson from this about, first of all, how we deal with difficulties in life, because regardless of which side of the story they're on, they're both stories of difficulty. Yaakov is just before the difficulty, he has to confront the challenge, and Alter Rebbe is speaking just after he's already been relieved of the difficulty. But the common thread is that this is how we deal with difficulty in our lives, and that's going to have a really useful insight for us, because unfortunately that's what happens. Unfortunately, we deal with difficulties in our lives. So what we could identify immediately as the common thread between both of their stories is they are both stories of an existential threat to the particular person. So in Yaakov's case, Esav threatens him and his family that, God forbid, he could destroy them. And in the Alter Rebbe's case, there's the threat to him on a personal level, but there is, by extension, the threat to the entire movement. And needless to say, if the Alter Rebbe is not able to function as the teacher of Hasidus Chabad, that would pretty much be the end of Hasidus Chabad, because it was just kind of building and hadn't yet created enough traction to be in a position that you could say, don't worry, we'll be able to keep going. So we've got to try and work out what's going on over here. So what we're going to notice as a common thread between Yaakov's story and the Alter Rebbe story, and this will be the linchpin to understanding what the lesson is for us. So what we'll see as a common thread between the two of them is that they both go through effectively 3 phases in these particular stories. And those 3 phases are a phase of success, a phase of deep challenge, and a phase of success. So if you look at Yaakov in his story, so we've got, actually Yaakov goes through multiple phases. First, you've got Yaakov at home when he's still living under the direction and the tutelage of his father, Yitzchak. So that's a successful phase of Yaakov's life. And he's in a very good spiritual place. And quite frankly, I think anybody would be envious of how good life was for him. But then because of the conflict with his brother Esav, he had to leave home. And we know that on his way leaving home, we saw in last week's parasha, whatever assets he took with him were no longer with him by the time he got to his destination, to Lavan. And Rashi tells us the story that Eliphaz, who was the son of Esav, chased after him and was going to kill him on his father's order. And eventually he said, look, just take everything. And there's a principle, it's a fascinating discussion. He says to him, there's a principle in Judaism that if a person is destitute, they're as good as dead. So you just take all my stuff and then I'll be as good as dead. You go back and tell your father that I'm dead. And so Yaakov goes through this destitute phase, which is obviously a very challenging phase. Then he's got all of the challenges of Lavan, but then he emerges again in a successful phase where he builds a beautiful family and a tremendous amount of wealth. And now he's in his next challenge phase, which is where there's a threat to all of this. Everything that he's done, everything he's invested in, everything that he's built up, potentially could all now be absolutely destroyed. Which means literally everybody could be killed. That's his fear, that Esav's going to kill everybody. And I wouldn't put that past Esav, because Esav is that much of an aggressor. He is that much of a bloodthirsty individual. So this is a real threat. Now we know how the story is going to end because we've read this parasha a few times. We know that what's going to happen at the end of the story is that Esav is going to dissolve from his belligerence. He's going to dissolve into actually a very welcoming, warm brother. He's going to embrace Yaakov. And then Yaakov's going to go from here into his next phase of success, which is he's going to return to Israel. The Torah is going to tell us in this week's parasha that he arrives back home shalem, which means that he hadn't really lost out in any sphere of life, that he was spiritually sound, that his family was whole, that he was financially on good footing. So he's going to go into another success phase. So that's effectively what we're seeing. There's a success phase, then there's a challenge, and then there's another success phase that follows. And it's very similar with the story of the Alter Rebbe, because you've got the Alter Rebbe building the Chabad Hasidic movement prior to this imprisonment. And that's a success phase. The movement is growing, and there are new adherents coming. For those people familiar with the history at that time, essentially what was happening is you had other religious Jews, many of them great scholars, who took exception to the ideas of Hasidus, and because of that there was this great conflict. But in the years of the Alter Rebbe building his movement, there were many of those scholars who were curious and open-minded enough to hear what Hasidus had to say, and many of them became followers of the Alter Rebbe. So there was a success phase. But then he goes through this very challenging phase of being in prison. And if you consider, while he's in prison, there are a few things that go on while he's in prison. One of them is, practically, he can't do his job. He can't teach anybody because there's no access. Nobody can get to him, and he can't get to anybody. There's no technology that he could churn out content and share it from behind the prison walls. So, and nobody knows how long this is going to last. So in that phase, there's this great challenge of not being able to continue with his life's work. And then, and that's besides the fact, obviously, that being in prison is a very difficult thing to undergo. And then after the story ends, so if you're familiar with Chabad Hasidic history, We know that the movement, the Chabad movement, only really takes off after he comes out of prison. And that's when you could say there's the explosion of Hasidus in the world. The Chabad movement as we know it now is only after he emerges from prison. So we see this common thread between the story of Yaakov and the story of the Alter Rebbe, that in both cases there's a success phase, then there's a depleted phase or a challenged phase, and then there's another success phase. Again, in the Torah, we're reading about Yaakov before he faces the challenge. In the Alter Rebbe's reference to Katonti, he's talking about after he's successfully escaped the challenge. But the common thread is success, challenge, and then success. And, very importantly, the nature of the success that follows is greater than the success that preceded the particular challenge. So that's actually what we need to explore. Because when we look at this word Katonti, in the way that Rashi describes it, it's a fear-based Katonti. I'm afraid I'm not great enough, or I'm afraid that I'm too small or too undeserving of the brachas that I've had and the brachas that I need. That's how Rashi contextualizes Yaakov's approach. In the Alter Rebbe's approach, it's that I've had this great bracha, and therefore I see myself as small because I'm humbled by how much Hashem has done for me. What we're going to try to analyze is, in both cases, it's pretty clear that the Katonti phase, that phase of feeling undeserving, that phase of feeling inadequate, that phase of feeling challenged, is somehow a key part of the growth into meaningful success. So that's what we've got to work out. Why is it that way? Why do you have to have a Katonti in order to have success? Okay, that's where we're going to explore.
Is the Rebbe talking about